One of the most significant societal and anthropological changes that took place in the Western world, but also globally in the past century, was the truly massive change in the position of women in society. For the first time in history, women are more educated than men in a number of countries, and they also often reached parity, or at least are close to it, on the labor market. Such a state of things has never been the case in any human civilization ever. Now, such a profound change is bound to have a multitude of consequences for a society: sociological, ideological, cultural, economic, and demographic. As a channel focusing primarily on various aspects of the current demographic crisis, wreaking havoc on our societies by creating unsustainable population imbalances, it is impossible to assess the situation properly without considering the influences of female emancipation. The relations of the two sexes are obviously central to the issue of demographics. Now, the time has finally come, since I just finished a book that delves into this subject with unprecedented insight and focuses on the broad range of areas that have been transformed by female emancipation. This book is called Lineages of the Feminine, an outline of the history of women, written by Emmanuel Todd. I know my use of Todd as a source has become sort of a meme, but what can you do? The guy has written a highly up-to-date, it was released in 2023, and a fascinating book dealing with most of the crucial subjects connected to female emancipation from a truly meticulously researched and broad perspective, spanning thousands of years. One of the crucial questions the book examines is the sort of contradictory nature of the current third-wave feminist ideology. How is it possible that the most antagonistic and aggressive form of feminist ideology, one that truly seems to set men and women against each other, gains prominence at a time when the objective educational and economic situation of women in the Western world is by any possible metric by far the best it has ever been anywhere? How come the most aggressive thrust against the patriarchy has come at a time when patriarchy, a loosely defined term without any substantive meaning, seems not to exist anymore, if it even ever has? The answer is fascinating, and I believe that it will surprise you. Moreover, one of the reasons why I appreciate Todd's view so much, apart from them being genuinely intellectually interesting and original, is that he is undoubtedly a leftist. He hails from bourgeoisie intellectual Parisian circles, graduated from high school in Paris in 1968, and was highly influenced by the leftist intellectual circles of those turbulent times. While I do not agree with him on a number of things, it has one significant perk. When he reaches some conclusion that would be standardly considered a right-wing position, you can be sure that this position is pretty much bulletproof, since Todd is internally ideologically arranged in a way that makes him dislike these positions. So, let's delve into the causes and consequences of the feminist revolution. Now, one of the main things that Emmanuel Todd dislikes about modern feminism, even though he generally strongly supports the female emancipation of the past century, is that it basically completely disregards the huge diversity of different societies, both throughout history and today, and how hugely the position of women in these societies differed. It basically takes a broad stroke approach and paints everything before our contemporary Western modernity, or sometimes even the contemporary times, as patriarchy. Such an approach is basically making the whole field of classical anthropology redundant, because if everything was the same oppressive patriarchy anyway, the meticulous research of different pre-modern societies and the role of women within them would be useless. Since the relationship and status of men and women in different cultures are central interests of anthropology, the effort to abolish the concept of men and women as clearly defined categories makes this field impossible to develop. However, there have been massive differences between the position of women in different societies, mostly due to the level of patrilineality. Patrilineality is a common kinship system in which an individual's family membership derives from and is recorded through their father's lineage. It generally involves the inheritance of property, rights, names, or titles by persons related through male kin. Basically, in a strongly patrilineal society, If you do not have any sons to whom you would leave your property, but only daughters, you would rather leave your stuff to a member of your male kin from your father's side, like a brother, an uncle, a cousin, or a nephew. In such societies, the position of women was very low, since they did not play any significant role in the transmission of property, names, rights, or titles. The epicenter of patrilineality, and thus the low position of women in society, is centered on the Beijing-Baghdad-Ouagadougou axis, stretching from Western Africa through the Middle East and Northern India to China, basically through the center of the Afro-Eurasian supercontinent. Most likely, the reason for this is the time that has passed since these areas adopted intensive agriculture. The whole point of the gradual densification of family systems was to develop ways of passing property from generation to generation, something that was not really a thing among hunters and gatherers, who could not accumulate any substantial property, such as land. Only when societies adopted agriculture and became sedentary did the need to establish the rules of passing property become an issue. So, along this axis, the position of women was, and in comparison with the West remains, low. That is best observed by the sex ratio of different countries, where the countries with a significant surplus of males represent the regions where the position of women is culturally lower. That usually manifests in female newborn infanticide, selective abortions, or higher importance of the nurture of male offspring when food is scarce. I would say that to most Westerners, even those who do not like feminism one bit, the idea of having an abortion if you find out you are expecting a female offspring is pretty wild. It is important to note that naturally, there are always a bit more male births than female births. But due to the universally higher mortality rates of men, given by higher proclivity towards violence, accidents in dangerous occupations, suicides, unhealthy lifestyles and whatnot, on a populational level, there is almost always more females than males. But in the belt of heavily patrilineal countries, this natural proclivity of men to die more is overcompensated by their preferential treatment. In my previous video on Iran, I mentioned that in the Middle Eastern clan family type, the position of women is relatively higher. That still holds, but only within the context of other heavily patrilineal cultures, like China or India, not universally, and definitely not in comparison with the West. So, to finally get to the West, defined in this video more restrictively as the westernmost edge of Europe, such as England and its Anglophone offshoot countries, France, Benelux and the Scandinavian countries, the position of women was always much higher. They were never rigidly excluded from inheritance, so the notion of passing your property to your nephew rather than to your daughter would not be applied. The kinship system was bilateral, so basically both sides of your ancestry line were taken into account. The more dense clannish family systems based on the passing of property through the male line never developed, and marriages were not arranged by the heads of the clans. Most of this region historically had various mutations of the nuclear family, where the married couple and its children function as a separate unit, not fundamentally connected to their broader families, which presupposes a certain level of equality between the sexes through this duality, even though the man was, of course, dominant. Christianity, especially Catholicism, was also a religion that further increased the status of women by forbidding arranged marriages through the consensual nature of Christian marriage, and increased their overall stability through its indissolubility. Christianity was a sexually rather repressive religion, which also suited women because throughout all of history until modernity, pregnancy and childbirth were some of the most dangerous things women could undertake, and the death rates were horrendous. The option of celibacy and chastity thus enabled women to escape this potentially deadly endeavor. Now, one of the things that I always found a bit off among sort of anti-feminist viewpoints of many people on the right is the notion that throughout history, women had it easy and were sheltered from the horrendous nature of life by brave men fighting off wild animals and invading tribes or armies. While men did all that for sure, it is very dishonest to forget that women indeed faced the forces of nature in their most primal form, childbirth. More women almost certainly died throughout history due to pregnancy and childbirth than men have due to war. I have witnessed the birth of my son, And even today, with all the medical amenities of modernity, it is a pretty brutal and primal experience. And while almost no men in contemporary West experience war, most women still experience childbirth. What hunting and war were to men for most of our species' history, labor was for women. So, overall, it is no surprise that the female emancipation of the 20th century took place and reached its most intense form in the West. The best way to showcase women's progress in society is through their educational ascension. Throughout the 20th century, a complete revolution occurred in the two sexes' educational levels. As Todd illustrates on French data, the year in which women overtook men as high school graduates was 1968, more than 50 years ago. Somewhere around the 1980s, women overtook men among the higher education graduates. Similar development took place in the countries of the Anglosphere or Scandinavia, places generally regarded as most advanced in terms of gender equality. In the US, university faculties went from 32% female in 1987 to over 50% female in 2020, and women predominate among college administrators. Medical schools went from less than 25% female in 1980 to 55% today. Law schools became majority female in 2016. So, the West has functioned in what Todd calls an educational matridominance for quite some time now. Once again, this is something completely unprecedented in the history of human education. In my video about the interplay of age structure and intrastate violent conflicts, such as civil wars or revolutions, I talked about the unprecedented age structure of our societies, which are the first in human history where the median age is not somewhere around 20, but around 40 instead, and how the very low proportion of young people and young males make the social dynamic in regards to violent conflicts fundamentally different from basically every society before the second half of the 20th century. This change regarding the education of women is of similar significance and magnitude. What could be the impacts? Well, where to start? First of all, Todd believes that the female educational and economic ascension was the final blow to the power of Christianity in the West. Since women were much more religious than men throughout much of the 20th century, they remained the last bearers of religiousness among the majority populations. That is partially caused by their educational ascension. The negative relationship between education and religiosity was established long before that, and the spread of universal literacy was one of the starters of the initial decline of Christianity in the previous centuries. But also by the invention of the contraceptive pill, introduced from the 1960s on, which basically gave women complete control over the reproductive consequences of intercourse. A lot of the social factors that made religiousness historically attractive for women, such as the danger of death during childbirth and the possibility of pregnancy without marriage, which was both socially and economically dangerous for women, were eradicated by the pill. The decline of fertility rates from the relatively high post-World War II baby boom levels followed shortly after that. While women started to dominate all levels of the educational system, their preeminence in various fields is very unequal. Women tend to highly dominate fields like psychology, anthropology, literary studies, biology, or sociology, but men continue to have an even stronger majority in fields like mathematics, physics, engineering, or information technology. When it comes to the labor market, women tend to heavily predominate among the bureaucratic managers in the public sector, especially at the lower and the middle levels. They also totally dominate sectors connected to care for other people, such as nurses, social workers, elderly carers, secretaries or assistants, and any professions revolving around children, like kindergarten teachers and educational workers in general. In medicine, women also have a majority, but there is a massive polarization between different medical professions. Women tend to dominate among pediatrics, endocrinologists, or dermatologists, while men remain the vast majority of surgeons of various kinds. Women also dominate artistic and entertainment information professions, such as journalism and scientific professions. Men remain prevalent in the highest levels of bureaucracy and politics, even though their preeminence there is declining. However, they still have absolute dominance among the top executive classes in the private sector. The vast majority of CEOs, chairmen, and members of director boards are men. Men tend to completely dominate fields like construction, carpentry and other trades, metalwork, mechanics, engineering, or natural resources extraction. Men completely dominate sectors connected to law and order, such as the police force or military. However, quite interestingly, women strongly outnumber men among judges. Now, this creates a very interesting dichotomy, which, and that is crucial, very closely follows the sexual division of labor observed among anthropologists researching hunter and gatherer tribes. In the vast majority of such tribes, men obviously hunted and waged war, but also vastly predominated at shelter and house building, except those tribes which used tents from fabric and skins, where women also did this. Boat building, fishing, and tool making, except pottery. Women, on the other hand, obviously dominated child rearing, caring for the wounded or the elderly, food preparation, gathering of food, pottery making, and working with leather and fabric. Now, if you look at it from the point of view of contemporary economic sectors, both sexes contributed relatively equally to the primary sector of the economy, which mostly revolved around agriculture and raw material extraction. Sure, they often did different parts of the process. Men hunted and caught fish while women gathered food and prepared it, but both sexes were indispensable. But the primary sector employs a minuscule percentage of the labor force in the current Western economies, around 2% on average. However, if we look at the secondary and tertiary sectors of the economy, we see that the ancient division of labor very neatly corresponds with the masculine nature of industry and the feminine nature of the service economy. Men dominate most fields oriented on transforming matter and making tools or other stuff out of it. Manufacturing, construction, engineering, technology, and extractive industries were and remain heavily male-dominated to this day. Services, the tertiary sector, such as education, hospitality, medical work, entertainment, journalism, direct care, and so on, are dominated by women. Moreover, the massive inflow of women into the labor force directly overlapped with the decline of industrial employment in these Western countries. In terms of economic relations, the deindustrialization of the Western countries hugely decreased the economic role of men, while the massive ascension of the service economy hugely empowered the economic position of women. The running of the metaphorical household of the nation, the state, is bureaucratically dominated by women as well. However, in private enterprises, the top echelons remain male. A significant part of the antagonistic nature of the current wave of feminism is, according to Todd, basically a gender-based class struggle. Women now dominate professions regarded in a standard class division as intermediate professions, skilled employees, middle class or petty bourgeoisie, while men remain prevalent at the top and at the bottom, among the upper middle classes and the wealthiest, and among the working classes as well. The weapon in this class struggle between female-dominated service middle classes and male-dominated industry and technology-based upper classes is ideology. Women heavily dominate fields that could be seen as ideology-shaping tools, fields that Todd calls Gramscian, after the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci, who developed the theory of cultural hegemony that needed to be established in order to achieve political hegemony later. Academia, especially humanities, entertainment, journalism, state administration, and so on. The massive predominance of women among judges also gives them certain legal authority over enforcing the ideology. Todd illustrates how the academic sociological research on the topic of gender in France is carried out by female researchers 85% of the time. For every male doctoral student interested in gender, there are 6 female doctoral students interested in the concept. He remembers his work at the French National Demographic Institute. When he joined in the 1980s, it was a male-dominated institution, heavily focused on a mathematical approach towards population issues. Today, the institution has 2/3 of female staff, while the proportion of female workers reaching as high as 90% among the youngest employees. The nature of the work in the institute shifted from rigorous mathematical projections to psychosociological issues and gender-related research, such as violence and gender relations. Third-wave feminism is the first major version of this ideology that can be considered anti-male in its essence, and the reason for that is the frustration with the lack of progress made by women who largely dominate educational and ideology-producing institutions in their effort to penetrate the highest echelons of the socio-economic ladder. However, their economic ascension, while certainly massive and hugely transformative, is likely arriving at certain hard biological limits demarcated by the evolutionary differences in the sexual division of labor, as outlined above. Men are, also most likely due to evolutionary reasons connected to hunting and fighting, better at spontaneously organizing themselves into groups and networks and working in them, which might also play a role in their preservation of dominance at the top of social structures. There are all the well-known hormonal differences between men and women, making men more aggressive and psychologically resilient on the broad statistical level, which can translate into higher drive in professional life. But there is also the crucial biological difference of childbearing. Basically, in the intrinsic quest for meaning, fulfillment and social status common to all people, men generally have only one option: to succeed in their profession, whatever it might be. Due to the natural female tendency for hypergamy, meaning marrying upwards in the social and economic hierarchy, men have much stronger incentives for trying to succeed professionally. Otherwise, they just won't be able to find a partner. However, women have two options. They can either focus on their profession or procreate. Procreation inevitably postpones the advancement in their economic and professional careers, but it also opens up a whole new area of meaning and fulfillment, in which women can find socially valuable and broadly accepted roles in life, not connected to professional success. In divorce settlements, the overwhelming majority of children are entrusted to the care of their mothers. In Western societies, with massive divorce rates, this further enhances the male overinvestment in work, since what are you going to do with your life after a divorce as a man? You can either become depressed and drink it away, or you just go even harder at work. That further enhances the natural imbalance in the ratio of success at the highest level between the sexes. But in the times of female emancipation, this is a double-edged sword. For most of history, a woman's social standing was largely dictated by her husband's profession. She could be the wife of a civil servant, factory owner, worker, or whatever. It did not give her an option of autonomously increasing her social status, but it also did not burden her with the responsibility for the social standing of the family, something that inevitably produced massive levels of anxiety among the male breadwinners. But today, women make their own fortunes. That brings them freedom, and female social mobility has massively increased. But social mobility does not have to go only up. It can also go down. So, women now experience what having autonomous power over your economic destiny feels like. But many likely found out that it does not always taste like victory. Todd showcases this on the convergence of the male and female life expectancies in Western countries, which is partially caused by the deindustrialization and thus the lower prevalence of dangerous male jobs, but also by higher female rates of alcohol, tobacco and drug abuse, endeavors that used to be much more heavily male-dominated. That is likely at least partially a reaction to their newly gained freedom and also social instability. And women have to, together with all of this, deal with the anxiety-inducing question of family planning in their quickly passing years between when they finish their educational process and start working, and the decline of their fertility after they reach 35. These massive new destabilizing forces in the lives of women are, according to Todd, the second most important factor, causing ideological polarization. Now, when it comes to the impacts of the aforementioned social processes, they are felt throughout several major issues. On the level of family, apart from the obvious decline in fertility rate, the most important change is the transition from hypergamy to hypogamy on a populational level. What it means is that most women no longer marry upwards, but downwards, at least in terms of education. Now, once again, female hypergamy is something that guys on the right often perceive as something bad or nefarious. But it is completely natural and beneficial for humankind, since women need to keep the well-being of their offspring in mind. It also ensures competition among men to succeed in finding a spouse, which is a motivational factor. While you might perhaps find hypergamy to be a hindrance in finding a partner, try to change your perspective. If you had, and I hope most of you had, a nice and comfortable childhood, it was likely also because your mother was hypergamic and chose your father, a competent and successful guy, as a husband. Suddenly, hypergamy is not so bad, is it? But since women have been more educated than men for several decades now, the end of hypergamy was inevitable. However, there are persistent differences in social class. Hypogamy is most prevalent among the middle classes, while at the top and the bottom of the social hierarchy, it is largely rejected. At the bottom of the social ladder, this leads to the highest prevalence of single-mother households, since women at the bottom do not even have the option of marrying down, since there is no one there, socially speaking. That also interplays with the economic dynamics of deindustrialization and female entering to the labor force, because while low-skilled working-class male occupations in industry were heavily diminished by deindustrialization, the same cannot be said of low-skilled female occupations in services, like nurses, care workers, waitresses, or secretaries. So, the lower social classes were highly negatively impacted by this process in terms of family stability. Among the upper classes, there is very little space to marry up, since you are already up, and being a single mother is also much less demanding if you are wealthy. So, homogamy prevails, the practice of marrying your social peers. But in the middle, hypogamy is most prevalent. But what is interesting is that according to research, women show significantly higher opposition towards hypogamy, so marrying down, than men do to marrying up. While women in the middle class do prefer the socio-economic stability of living in marriage to being single, they do so rather reluctantly. So, there is another paradox presenting itself. Since the social class where women are most dominant and which verbally most radically espouses the newly antagonistic feminist ideology, as well as other progressivist theories, the said women do not actually live by their creed, and they rather massively opt for the traditional married life in an economic environment where two salaries are needed. However, it is possible that their inner dissatisfaction with the need to marry down is also contributing to the overall ideological polarization. That is a catch-22 situation, since the strive for female emancipation and female educational domination creates a situation in which mass hypergamy becomes mathematically impossible. If women intrinsically desire to have partners of higher social standing, this rules out the possibility of gender equality. On the ideological level, apart from the aforementioned decline of Christianity and the emergence of a rather antagonistic feminist ideology, the broader ideological impacts are also tied to the rise of the woke or liberal progressive movement, or whatever you want to call it. In France, the sociological research carried out on the word sex and its different variations like sexuality, homosexuality, and so on, is carried out by female researchers in 68% of the cases. Todd also points out, as anecdotal evidence, that the 2019 edition of the OECD annual report Society at Glance, which chose the rights of the LGBT minorities around the globe as its top social priority, was supervised by a female head of the department and edited by a woman, assisted by 3 other female authors and 1 male author. Research shows that men are just more homophobic or less accepting of homosexuality than women are. Similar connections can be observed regarding the transgender phenomenon. Now, people on the right often propose a thesis that women tend to apply their intrinsic value of care, stemming from the evolutionary instinct of care for children, to the realm of politics, and that makes them more prone to support policies that enhances the principle of care and unharmful approach in politics towards various minorities, whether sexual or ethnic. But this has always seemed a bit strange to me for one reason. Women, in their role as mothers, definitely do not care for all children in the same way. On the contrary, they are highly selective and care for their offspring first and foremost. The mother would do anything to protect and ensure her child's survival, as she of course should. In a world of inherently highly limited resources, It would go against all natural instinct to share those resources with other children at the expense of your own. While women are altruistic, something innate to them due to their motherhood, this altruism is selective and applies to their children, not all people. Now, Todd proposes a different explanation. He points out that in hunter-gatherer societies, there was a deeper difference in the sexual division of labor. When men hunted or engaged in combat, the result of their collective efforts were always shared among the whole tribe, either as meat, in the case of hunting, or as a protection of the tribe from physical annihilation, in the case of fighting. Now, in the case of hunting, this might have initially been caused by the simple fact that without any cooling technology, meat must be consumed quickly before it rots. Not that the meat would be shared equally. The most capable hunter might get a larger share, but it was shared nevertheless. Women, on the other hand, gathered food individually, and the fruits of their labor were also consumed individually, within their families. Men are thus more inclined to be invested in collective and collective identities. They are more invested in the strengthening of their in-group. Collective identities, whether racial, ethnic, or even sexual, always encompass an element of exclusion, aimed against other identities or other groups. We define who we are, also by pointing out who we are not. Now, the notion that women are more individualistic than men might seem very contradictory to the common knowledge that regards men as being the more individualistic sex, which is affirmed by most sociological research. However, the situation is different if applied to the question of collective identities. Men are consistently shown by research to be more nationalistic, more opposed to immigration, more hostile towards foreigners or different ethnic groups, as well as more opposed to same-sex marriage or transgender issues. I mean, what percentage of women are among the viewers of this YouTube channel? Not much. Men, thus, seem to be more invested in the preservation of collective identities, while women seem much more inclined to their dissolution via their attraction to ideological currents that emphasize individual identity. Todd thus believes that female emancipation was the crucial element that led to a weakening of collective identities in the West, whether religious, national, class, or mass political movements, and, in the end, even the dissolution of the most elemental collective identities, men and women. The discourse became much more interested in the identity of the individual, and much less interested in the identity of the group. Finally, Todd examines the correlation between the economic rise of women and deindustrialization, or, on the other hand, the industrialization of different areas of the planet. There is a peculiar connection between the level of female educational and occupational attainment, the level of industrialization, the fertility rate, and the level of success enjoyed by the progressivist ideology. Basically, there is a belt of countries stretching from Germanic Central Europe through Eurasia to China, where the predominance of industrial activity within the economy remains high. The position of women has been historically lower than in Western Europe, the fertility rate is generally low, and where the ideological resistance to female-based ideology has been persistent. Now, I must acknowledge that the inclusion of German-speaking Europe is rather controversial, since most people definitely would not perceive Germany as a country resistant to progressivism. However, Todd tends to look more at educational data and points out that women overtook men among college graduates in Germany in 2016, almost 40 years later than in most Western countries. Now, demographers and sociologists have for a long time observed that countries that are more egalitarian in their gender roles, such as the Anglosphere, France or Scandinavia, have higher fertility rates than those that combine certain cultural traditionalism with modern labor markets, like Eastern Europe or East Asia. In societies in which the female role as a mother is culturally profoundly ingrained, it is harder for women to combine motherhood and work, and they often feel like they have to choose. That is a hard choice in an economic environment where two salaries are usually needed. However, in the more egalitarian countries in the west of Europe or the Anglosphere, this choice is made easier by the prevalence of part-time jobs for mothers and whatnot, or the cultural acceptability of women returning to work very soon after labor. The fact that those countries have more service-based economies make it even easier for women to apply themselves. So, Todd proposes it is sort of a multi-layered trade-off. Countries with an anthropologically higher status of women have proceeded furthest in their educational and economic ascension, which interplayed with the deindustrialization of their economies from the 1970s onward. The labor market sort of readjusted itself to the influx of educated women. The progressivist ideology is strongest in these societies where women gained predominance in the ideology shaping middle classes. But the fertility rate has also been significantly higher in the past 30 years, often relatively close to 2 children per woman. People usually claim this is due to the high immigrant population, but that is a myth. Native women in these countries have higher fertility as well, and if you look at Germany or Austria, countries with high immigrant populations, their fertility has remained low. So you have significant deindustrialization of economies with all the negative consequences of that process, which is especially damaging to Western lower classes, but higher reproductive rates on one side, and more severe demographic issues, but higher levels of industrialization on the other. The industrial backbone of these countries allows them to retain more masculine values, since the industry is an inherently male-oriented economic sector, due to the ancient sexual division of labor. Now, not that I want to brag, but do you know which country has the highest proportion of industrial employment on the planet? Yeah, that's right. Either you go extinct while remaining based, or you reproduce long enough to become woke. But fundamentally, Todd suggests that due to women's newly found economic independence in combination with technological progress regarding childbearing and human reproduction, Western countries might be the first in human history to move beyond the human couple as a primary organizational unit of society. History does not give us any clues about the viability of such a model on a macro-societal scale. As with many other issues in our current times, we are experiencing demographic and anthropological phenomena that are entirely new. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, or consider supporting me on my Patreon or on my Buy Me a Coffee. Thank you very much.